Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this Christians in Science online event. If you don't know me, my name is Gavin Merrifield, and I am the General Secretary of Christians in Science, and I'll be hosting you for this evening. Now, this event has been organised by Christians in Science. We are an organisation that seeks to encourage and build better relations between the church and the modern scientific enterprise. We also provide opportunities for fellowship and support for Christians who work in the sciences. And as part of this, our events run from a Christian perspective, but anyone from any background with an interest in how science, religion, and faith might positively enrich each other is very welcome. You can go to our website at www.cis.org.uk to find out more about us or to access some of our other resources. Recordings from our past events and conferences can be found on our YouTube page. And if you would like to support our work in a practical way, then can I ask you to consider whether you might become a member or a friend of CIS if you are not already, or just by making a donation to help fund our ongoing work. Details for all of these options, again, can be found on our website. I hope that you've all had some good summers and are feeling refreshed and relaxed from them. Over mine, I seem to have ended up reading a number of books on the history of science and faith, mainly how the two interacted in the kind of 19th century, during fresh discussions and new discoveries around the geological and biological sciences, and also thinking at the time about how to interpret scripture. And this year is also the 80th anniversary of Christians in Science. So I've been very much aware of that more recent history, as well as now thinking about that older history from reading those books. But there's a period between those two times where we seem to have a considerable gap that we don't talk about very much, but during which much still happened in conversations around science and religion. And tonight's talk will be given by Sam McKee, who will help us fill in that gap a bit by looking at the figure of Arthur Eddington, who was, amongst other things, a scientist who played a key role in popularizing and giving evidence for Einstein's theory of general relativity. Eddington, as we shall hear, was also active in conversations around science and faith in this period, which was one of great transformation in the physical sciences as well. So Sam is... I've been thinking about this all day today. Well, he's hard to describe. He's a person of many talents and interests, which I'm sure will come through tonight. And among his many hats, he's currently a doctoral researcher and tutor in philosophy at the Manchester Metropolitan University, and he's the director of Aylesbury Vale Youth for Christ, where he is very active in using science to excite and increase the aspirations of young people. He studied genetics at Cambridge and molecular biology at Birkbeck, as well as theology at Chester. And he currently researches DNA repair and has had an experiment flown on the International Space Station as part of his work with the International Space School Educational Trust. And his thesis is on the interwar physicists, which we'll hear a bit about tonight. And he is part of an academic consortium on the history of physics. Now, if that's not enough, he's also a member. Well, he's on the board of the Mars Society UK, and he's a Christians in Science committee member, and lately a very prolific and energizing writer at a number of publications on all things science and faith. So we'll follow our usual format of listening first to our speaker and then having some time for questions and discussions at the end. Please put your questions into the chat window here in Zoom as they occur to you, or keep them to the end, but beware you may forget them if you don't put them in sooner. We will pass as many of these past Sam as possible. We'll aim to wrap up about 8 p.m, unless, of course, the questions keep coming and we keep going. If that happens, don't feel obliged to stay beyond 8 p.m. if you need to head off. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Sam, who will give us his talk. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to probably the most important scientist you've never heard of. He's barely mentioned in science and religion, and when you examine his profile and history, it's very hard to see why. Sir Arthur Eddington is a very, very important physicist of his time, one of the greatest mathematicians our country produced in the 20th century, and is very, very important in the history of physics. He's very important to the birth of astrophysics as a discipline and philosophy of science as a discipline. And yet he's criminally unknown and underappreciated. And I found this when I did my master's in theology on him and his approach to science and religion. And I'm doing my philosophy of science doctorate on him at the moment. And it's very hard. It's like being in on a secret that no one else has figured out yet. But the secret will be open tonight, and I hope you'll come to appreciate not only Eddington, but how interesting this interwar physics era is. Einstein's generation in terms of the Christian astronomers and astrophysicists of that time. Sir Arthur Eddington was born in 1882 in the Lake District in Kendal. His father was a head teacher, but his father died at 2 years old, leaving him with his mother and his sister, who he sought to look after for the rest of his life. It was a Quaker family. His father was a headmaster at a Quaker school. They moved very shortly after that down to Weston-super-Mare and then up to Manchester. He was very prodigious as a student. He's a remarkable mind, and he gained a scholarship as a teenager to Owens College, which is now the University of Manchester, when he was 16. And after 3 years of incredible success in maths and physics, he gained a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge. He was the first person ever to become senior wrangler in just his second year, which is still unprecedented. He became the Astronomer Royal in Greenwich after he graduated with his degree and his master's from Cambridge. And he was in charge of the Greenwich Observatory for a year. He won the Smith's Prize in 1907, and after that he was made a Fellow of Trinity College in Cambridge. In 1912, when he's still remarkably young, he was promoted to Isaac Newton's chair as Plumian Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge, and he held that role for the rest of his life, living in what is now the Institute of Astronomy for the rest of his days with his mother and his sister. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society shortly before the First World War began in 1914. Now, later on in his life, when Albert Einstein was asked what was Eddington's greatest contribution, without hesitation, he said it was stellar physics. And it's in 1916, during the First World War, that Eddington really begins to flex his muscles in terms of stellar physics. Now, it's very important to realize that at this time, barely anything is really known about the nature and the structure of stars. There are still ideas going around at this time that maybe the stars sort of have wood in the middle of them and are just burning, burning fuel hanging there in space. No one knows how they sustain their heat, energy, and light, and it's all very theoretical. Now, Eddington in 1916 makes his first major breakthrough, still very young. He writes a book called Stellar Movements and the Structure of the Universe. And this sets him on a course which is deeply fiery and controversial for the Royal Astronomical Society. And here's where I really want to bring in Eddington's Quaker influence. Now, Eddington was very young during the Second Quaker Renaissance. And during this time, there was great enthusiasm and organization amongst the British Quakers. And they are very, very keen to move with new knowledge, which is inherent to Quakers. Quakers are non-dogmatic. They are open to outside revelation. They're very open to new sources of knowledge. And you can clearly see in Eddington his Quaker approach to life. I mean, Eddington is called by the Quakers today the ideal Quaker scientist. He brings this very different approach to his model building for stars. When he's considering the star's interior, he is more than willing to break the rules and go off script in ways that the other members of the Royal Astronomical Society just thought bizarre. He will cut corners and he will just jump over levels in the maths to try and build a model that works. And he builds a model that is able to account for the gravity, the radiation, the pressure, and this unconventional model building just works. It starts bringing together all the data to figure out how what a star's internal structure is. And Sir James Jeans and Edward Arthur Milne and other astronomers in Cambridge and in the Royal Astronomical Society say, you can't do that. This is madness. You know, we have structures, we have principles. You can't just, you know, you're cheating, basically. But Eddington was not dogmatic. He was not going to be held to traditions, especially ones that didn't work. And what he finds is what later became known as the Eddington luminosity number, the relationship between a star's mass and its luminosity. And it's incredibly fruitful. It just starts solving not only the problem of a star's probable internal structure, but it can be applied to other areas of astronomy with great success. And so he is part of a group that trigger this boom in stellar physics. It worked. I mean, it was outrageous. It was controversial, but it had to be followed with a reluctant acceptance. And it came really from Eddington's Quaker methodology and approach. He correctly discerned that stars gain their energy by nuclear fusion. And this was before it was even known that stars were comprised predominantly of hydrogen. And so his very unconventional approach is very successful. And as I mentioned earlier, Einstein considers Eddington's discernment of the Eddington luminosity and how stars get their energy from nuclear fusion to be his greatest achievement. In 1926, he writes The Internal Constitution of the Stars, which is a model textbook for astronomy students for more than 50 years after his death. He writes a popular book that same year called Stars and Atoms, which brings this knowledge to the general public and helped launch him as a very popular writer. More on that later. Now, the way he describes this methodology as a Quaker is intuition and seeking. It was an approach to problem solving, which he drew from his spiritual life and applied to his astrophysics. He's more readily incorporates relativity and quantum physics as soon as it comes to light, because he's more than happy to look for new sources of knowledge and be non-dogmatic about these things. Now, I need to get to Einstein here. We are very, very fortunate that Eddington discovered Einstein. During the First World War, the German physicists are being scouted essentially by the Cambridge physicists. And Eddington is given the job of scouting an unknown Albert Einstein. And Willem de Sitter in the Netherlands passes Eddington Einstein's work on relativity, which had not been read by anyone in the UK thus far. And Eddington thinks there's something to this. I think we might have a new theory of gravity here. Now, this is controversial. You have a British physicist who's holding Isaac Newton's chair, saying, I think Newton is wrong and this German scientist is right, during the First World War. So Eddington and Einstein start communicating to each other through de Sitter in the Netherlands in secret. Eddington, one of the first things he does is he applies Einstein's maths to the problem of the orbit of Mercury and finds that it solves the problem. He writes to Einstein to tell him this, and the story goes that Einstein was dancing in his bedroom for a day. And so they begin communicating, and Eddington, as a Quaker, is a fierce pacifist. That's a contradiction in terms, but he's a pacifist to the hilt. Einstein is as well, and they are both internationalists, and they are opposed to the war at every level. And Eddington sees the opportunity to prove that Einstein is right as a mission of peace and a mission of internationalism, an opportunity to restore international cooperation in science away from nationalism and tribalism. And he, along with Sir Frank Dyson, convinced Cambridge University to fund a voyage to take photos of a solar eclipse in 1919. If the stars around the sun are deflected because of the sun's gravitation, according to Einstein's relativity and its equations, then Einstein is right and relativity is correct. If not, then they will have proven that a German scientist is wrong and that Newton is still lord over all science. So that is a great way of broaching it to the British, and they fund the voyage. And this is what Eddington is most famous for. is the voyage to the island of Principe off the coast of Africa in 1919 to take a very famous photo of the eclipse. And when they bring the results back, it's an incredible story that everyone should read in itself. It's been turned into a film. When they get back to Cambridge to reveal the plates and reveal the results, Eddington stands under a giant painting of Sir Isaac Newton, and he begins his presentation by saying, "Forgive us, Sir Isaac, for you have been undone," and then reveals the results. And the next day, Einstein is world famous. Eddington makes Einstein world famous by unveiling this. It's all over the British papers, then it's all over the international papers. A new theory of gravity, Newtonian physics, is overthrown. And that's just the start, actually. Eddington becomes the greatest popularizer and writer of relativity. He writes a book called Space, Time and Gravitation, and then another book 2 years later called The Mathematical Theory of Relativity. And Einstein, Eddington's death, said that Eddington was the greatest expositor of relativity that there ever was. He was able to explain it in layman's terms, as well as to scientists and academic scientists. But that's just the beginning. That's 1919 going into the 1920s. In 1924, a Belgian priest by the name of Georges Lemaitre arrives at Cambridge. And Lemaitre is put under Eddington's care because Lemaitre has a PhD in Belgium, but it doesn't count in England. And so he's doing some further doctoral work because Lemaitre has got a hold of this mathematical side of relativity and wants to apply it to the cosmos. And he's under Eddington's care, and Eddington sees where Lemaitre is going, and he arranges for Lemaitre's papers on cosmology to be translated into English. And then he says, as he did with Einstein, "I think this guy is onto something. This whole universe might have a beginning thing." And Eddington writes the first English language book on the Big Bang, called The Expanding Universe, in 1931. So as with Einstein, he wasn't the one making the discovery, but he was the one telling the world about it and then translating it into English. He was the first guy to really get onto it. And it was hugely controversial at the time, but Eddington became the communicator of it. Now, about this time, Eddington is a household name. He's one of the most popular science writers of his era. In fact, his books sold in, if they were compared to modern levels, he would be one of the most popular science writers of our day. Hundreds of thousands of copies, which for the 1920s and 30s is pretty extraordinary. And people know he's a Quaker as it comes up. He's a bit of a different cat. In 1925, it was probably the worst of times for science and religion. 1925 was the year of the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee. But in 1925, we get Eddington's first writing on science and religion in a collection by Joseph Needham, the chemist, called Science, Religion and Reality, which is still a treasure today. And I urge people to get it. It's a fascinating work. Eddington writes a chapter called The Domain of Physical Science. And in it, he makes clear that relativity and quantum physics are not evidence for God, but as he sees it, they clear the path to make a spiritual world far more recognizable and understandable. And this is his first venture into it, but it triggers a lot more. In 1927, he writes a book called The Nature of the Physical World. And in it, he says, "I have to conclude that the nature of ultimate reality is spiritual. Everyone is waiting for the great popularizer of science to explain what relativity and quantum physics mean. The world as we know it has changed. The ground beneath our feet has changed forever. The ordered structure of Newtonian physics that we knew the world to be is gone, and in its place is something more accurate and better, but no one understands it. So what is the great popularizer of relativity going to tell us that this means?" And he says, "I conclude that the nature of ultimate reality is spiritual." Boom. That's explosive. And now all of the philosophers and the humanists at Cambridge University are not happy. Chief of all, a Mr. Bertrand Russell. Now, Eddington is only just getting started. In 1929, He speaks at the Swarthmore. He gives the Swarthmore lecture, which is the Quaker conference, and it's transcribed into a book called Science and the Unseen World. It is a gem. Everyone should get and read this little book called Science and the Unseen World by Sir Arthur Eddington. It's an incredible contribution to the literature on science and religion by the greatest of his time, in my opinion. And in Science and the Unseen World, Eddington outright states more than once, materialism is dead. No one can go back to materialism. It's dead, dead, dead. Relativity and quantum physics, and now its unfolding consequences in cosmology, mean materialism is dead. And he's not alone. Eddington begins a fashionable rejection of materialism amongst physicists. Sir James Jeans is the next to come along, who writes a book called The Mysterious Universe. Then he writes The Growth of Physical Science. Then he writes EOS. Edward Arthur Milne joins in later on with a book called Modern Cosmology and the Christian Idea of God. Again, a treasure for its time, which people just haven't heard of. Joseph Needham starts writing more about science and religion. Lord Balfour, Pupin, Charles Raven, Dean Inge, all these people who are not popularly known, but were giants of the era whose books sold in huge amounts. Eddington triggers a fashionable resistance to materialism from the physicists and then from other scientists. While over in America, people are debating evolution, in Britain, a very, very different world of science and religion is taking place. Bertrand Russell strikes back. He writes Why I Am Not a Christian, one of the most famous atheist books. Eddington, who quite likes Russell, although the feeling is not mutual, writes a counterbook called Why I Believe in God, Science and Religion as a Scientist Sees It. And Bertrand Russell is furious about this and writes a book called The Scientific Outlook, which is just a hatchet job on Eddington and Jeans. If you read The Scientific Outlook, it's pretty clear that Bertrand Russell probably hadn't read Eddington's book, or he certainly didn't understand it, but that's not going to stop him. He later writes Science and Religion, which is his own attack and take on science and religion from the physicists. Susan Stebbing writes a book called Philosophy and the Physicists, where she tries to clear them up and put them in their place. And Chapman Cohen, the head of the Free Thinker, writes God and the Universe, which is his take on them as well. So there we go. It starts. They start kicking back. However, things have changed. In 1931, the BBC holds its first ever symposium on science and religion, which you can still get if you're lucky from a library or on Amazon or something like that. It's the BBC's first ever symposium on science and religion. Julian Huxley writes in it, Pupin writes in it, and Eddington writes a chapter. It's an astounding collection of some of the giants of the era writing chapters on their approach to science and religion. I don't know why people haven't heard of it. I don't know why it's not used in Christian apologetics, but it's phenomenal. Eddington was the keynote speaker. He was the main dog in the show. Then we get to the 1930s come along. Eddington contributes two further works, which are both lectures which are transcribed. The first is New Pathways in Science, where he develops more his thoughts from the nature of the physical world. And then he writes Philosophy of Physical Science, which is his last great contribution to the philosophy of science. I just want to, I realize we're short of time and there's so much more that can be said on this amazing story. But Eddington is credited with saving the faith of hundreds of scientists around the world who were being forced by fundamentalism to make a choice between science and religion. Eddington he arrived right on time. And two of his biographers make note of the fact that he became a popular speaker whenever he was visiting a university internationally. He would get asked to speak on science and religion as an extra lecture. And a lot of people who felt cornered by fundamentalism at the time were very comforted by this reassuring old accomplished physicist who was giving a very different kind of message. Dorothy Sayers takes a shot at him in a book saying, "Don't go all Eddington," one of her characters says, because Eddington was seen as this different guy. He was not the evidentialist natural theologian of his day. He was someone who was taking a very different approach, almost like a theory of everything. The Cambridge Society of Friends, where the Quakers would meet, where Eddington was the treasurer and the secretary. One of the worshippers noted that you had the sense with Eddington that his experience with God was something that no one else would understand. He would just go to the window and look outside, and she says, you wondered what on earth was going on in his head, but you knew full well you would never understand it, the way he was communing with God. Now, here's why I think Eddington's not really known. He made some huge blunders towards the end of his career, and they really damaged his legacy. Furthermore, I think C.S. Lewis came along afterwards and just blew Christian apologetics to a new level, and everything that came before it was mostly swept aside. But Eddington, he got black holes wrong, and I mean dead wrong. Some people never forgave him, felt that he set astrophysics back 30 years. He had a young PhD student under his care called Chandrasekhar, who went on to win the Nobel Prize. And Chandrasekhar said, I think black holes are a thing. Eddington stood up afterwards and embarrassed him and said, nope, they're definitely not. And anyone who thinks black holes exist is a fool. And Chandrasekhar had to leave for the University of Chicago with his tail between his legs. Chandrasekhar was right, obviously. And he was vindicated, but they remained on good terms. And when Eddington died, Chandrasekhar wrote his obituary, wrote a biography of him, and called him the greatest astrophysicist of his time. Eddington's next two books were his worst. They were his two biggest failures. He wrote a book called Relativity Theory of Protons and Electrons, which was a very bizarre, worthless take on quantum physics that no one understood. And after he wrote that, he was no longer invited to the inner circle of physicists on quantum physics. And to this day, you can't get a physical copy of it. It's seen as a worthless relic in history. But unfortunately, that wasn't to be the worst of it. Eddington spent the last 14 years of his life trying to come up with a theory of everything. And he would lock himself away, give fewer talks, write fewer works, and just apply himself to trying to solve a theory of everything. Now, when he died suddenly in 1944 from cancer, he was just finishing it. And his sister asked Whittaker, the Cambridge mathematician, to try and complete it for him. And it was published posthumously as a work called Fundamental Theory. Now, I spoke to Martin Rees about this. Martin Rees is becoming a good friend of mine, and he's helping me a lot with my PhD. And I asked Martin about it, and he said it's of historical interest, but not a single shred of valid science has ever emerged from fundamental theory. The whole world was expectant. Oh, wow, here's Eddington's work. Eddington's had to go to theory of everything. Let's see what it is. And there was this collective, really? When you read it, firstly, it's almost completely incomprehensible. Whittaker said there's probably only 7 people on the planet who understood what on earth Eddington was talking about. But when you did figure out what he was talking about, and Jeans and Whittaker and others basically translated it to the general public, it's been mockingly referred to as numerology. Basically, Eddington was trying to come up with a spiritual theory of everything. He wanted a theory of everything that can encompass mind and consciousness. And this was seen as a very bizarre thing to do in the first place. But he seemed to think that certain numbers possessed a power. In a sense, it is numerology. Maurice Wilkins, who gave one of the Eddington Memorial Lectures, the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist, when he talks about Eddington, he adds, 137 and all that, because Eddington seemed to think the number 137, because it kept cropping up, was a constant that was very, very important. So Eddington became the 137 guy. And that just shows how his reputation had degraded at the end of his life. He became something of ridicule for failing to solve a theory of everything. But I mean, Stephen Hawking couldn't do it. No one's done it since. Maybe we should give the guy a break for having a go. And unfortunately, Eddington, there's the big gap of people even attempting a theory of everything. It was a cautionary tale. If you try and solve a theory of everything and you get it wrong, you could end up like Eddington, publicly humiliated. Now, Eddington also dies during World War II. He died in 1944, which meant he didn't get the plaudits that his death should have come with. But a memorial lectureship was set up in his memory afterwards, and it is a absolute gold mine of treasure for people who are interested in science and religion, or the intersection of science, religion, and philosophy. Every single year, and they were published by Cambridge University Press through until the mid-1970s, a notable speaker would be invited to give a talk that would be published in a small book by Cambridge University Press on some matter of interest between science, philosophy, and religion in Eddington's memory. And it's a who's who of incredible speakers. Donald Mackay, who we've had a focus on at one of our Christians in Science conferences a few years ago, gave one. Michael Polanyi gave one. Ronald Fisher of the Modern Evolutionary Synthesis gave one, the Anglican geneticist, one of the greatest writers since Darwin on evolution. Chuck Coulson, the giant in science and Christianity, gave one. John Hick, the philosopher of religion, gave one. And then you have all the Nobel Prize winners who gave one through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Maurice Wilkins gave one of the Eddington lectures on science and the divine. Most people don't even think of Maurice Wilkins as a Christian, but that was the title of his lecture, and I've read it. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Sir Roger Penrose gave one. Francois Jacob gave one. Max Perutz gave one. These are an incredible legacy to leave behind in science and religion in Eddington's memory. Now, there was a small gap, and they were restarted in 2009 with a focus solely on astronomy. And they are funded by the Royal Astronomical Society and the Institute of Astronomy now. But these lectures still go on in his memory. And he was finally memorialized in 2019 at the centenary of the eclipse voyage. And Eddington now has his own suburb in Cambridge. It has a Sainsbury's and it has some student accommodation. So I suppose Eddington's legacy lives on in that manner, at least today. Maybe we should all be so lucky to get our own Sainsbury's and our own student accommodation. But Eddington is now finally getting some of the memorial he deserves, but not in science and religion. And I think it's time that changed. I hope this has interested you. And I hope you look him up and look up some of his legacy afterwards. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very, very inspiring talk. I think I had questions that I was going to ask, and I'm like, oh, where can we find out more? Who are the other players? But the list of names you've given us so far is incredible. I think there's a lot we can be digging into there. I only recognise a handful of those names. Just a quick question, as I invite people to put their own questions into the chat window. Those Eddington lectures, is there an online list anywhere of them?
Yes, there is. Let me copy it into the chat. The Institute of Astronomy has it. But up until the mid-70s, they were published by Cambridge University Press. And so you can get a number of them, and they are brilliant. They're very small, very short, very snappy, but they're very, very interesting. They're of historical interest, but they're also, some of them are really good. Michael Polanyi's is fantastic. He wrote a little one called Beyond Nihilism. John Hick wrote one called Biology and the Soul, which is very interesting. Ronald Fisher wrote one called Creative Aspects of Natural Law, trying to look at the creative elements behind evolution, which is quite interesting. So yeah, check them out.
Well, Sam's put the link in the chat there, but I'll make sure it's sent around to everyone who's registered as well. I'll start us off with a question on, you said about the fundamentalists. Again, in America, but we had some in the UK as well. What did they make of him?
So Bertrand Russell and Chapman Cohen and Susan Stebbing and those likes, they were very mocking of the Anglicans and the Catholics who suddenly seemed to become Quakers overnight, because Eddington was being used as a and leverage that science now pointed to the existence of God for certain. Now, Eddington was not an evidentialist. He was much more about wonder and about the spirit. I didn't mention earlier, but there's this wonderful bit in Science and the Unseen World, which is what got me onto Eddington in the first place, where he says, many people come into our observatory and they look through the telescope at the stars or the rings of Saturn, and they quote Psalm 19, verse 1, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies show the work of his hands." And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, myself and my colleagues, we roll our eyes. And he's asked, well, what scripture comes to mind when you look at science, look at the natural world? And he says a very different passage. I think of 1 Kings, Elijah in the cave, and there's a great fire, and God's not in the fire. Then there's a great earthquake, and God's not in the earthquake. There's a rushing wind, and God's not in the wind. And then afterwards comes the still small voice. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Eddington says, there you have meteorology, seismology, thermodynamics, all at work, and God passes by in silence with them all. But afterwards, why are you here? Why are you here? And I remember first reading that and thinking, I don't know what he's saying, but I really like it. And I wanted to know. I wanted to get Eddington, but Eddington's Quaker take was different, and I think it had that effect on a lot of people. A lot of people who had been through the natural theology of the 19th century, the Bridgewater treaties and all that, were very much, well, what's the new evidence? Is this relativity evidence? Is this quantum physics evidence? Is the Big Bang evidence? And then Lemaitre had a fight with the Pope, basically. Like, no, don't use it as proof of God. Lemaitre was a lot more aligned with Eddington. What this is firstly, it means materialism isn't true. Secondly, it just comes down further on the our nature as something different. Think of the importance of the observer in relativity. Suddenly the observer matters. This is a very different world we live in, and he thought it gave more room for the spirit, the spiritual nature of man. But not everyone understood it.
Yeah.
Are we allowed to talk?
Yes, go for it.
Great talk, Sam. Very much a eulogy, methinks. I do know about Eddington mainly through his 2 tables, and it's a Gifford. You didn't mention it, but actually, as qua philosophy, we've heard of him because he talks about the table he's sitting at, writing his thesis or whatever, and then he thinks as a physicist as a lot of atoms whizzing around, and why can I put my hand on it? And I think, yeah, that's really interesting, because I'm very much with you. And what's material, the thing in itself, as Kant might refer to. We are material. I mean, going back to the Bible, we are made of the dust. That is clearly, and I think you would agree, whatever we define dust, which you might call material, we're not. The only thing that's different is the ruach, the breath of God. I mean, I'm just going back to Genesis, one of the stories. Would you agree with that as a Christian? So I agree with you. I do think he mentioned about measurement. Once you get into the realms of quantum mechanics, it's all maths, and explaining it in English or whatever language you speak, it doesn't really work. It just is whatever you do with the mathematics, and particularly theoretical thing. I'm no quantum mechanic, I'm not even a physicist, but I do understand that. So this is where we just run out of words, I think. And if a maths works, well, great. But we are made of the dust, however we define the dust. The difference is the breath of God, which gives us all these thoughts we have, which can't really be explained. I would agree with that. I mean, have you looked at the sort of more the philosophy? The other thing, yes, Russell, you gave him a bad press. I love Russell. I don't obviously agree with everything he says, but he has to be respected as a mathematician and a philosopher. And you say you attacked him. I would have thought he had certain respect for what he said. I haven't read those.
Yeah, so but I'm trying to pick out what I think of the questions.
Yes, I
yes, I know you, Paul. So yes, firstly, let me clear up. His Gifford lectures was made into the book The Nature of the Physical World. So if you want to know more about this and where his philosophy comes in, get a copy of The Nature of the Physical World. You can find it quite easily. It's probably his main most popular book. It sold the most. In terms of the two tables, yes, I'll just explain that for people. Eddington talks about the table of the physicist and the table of the ordinary person. He also tells a similar story of, the physicist and the ordinary human being try and cross a bridge. The ordinary human being crosses the bridge with no problem. The physicist panics looking at it, knowing that it's mostly empty space and a lot of atoms which are moving at great speed, which are very spread out, and the physicist just can't cross the bridge. And he uses that to sort of illustrate the difference between, the way the physicist thinks and the way the normal person thinks. And really, we should come down more on the side of the normal person. But anyway, my PhD's on Eddington and materialism. And I'm not sure I really understand your Christian argument for the material self. I think what I'd say Eddington's take on it is that
you're formed out of the earth.
Yeah, Eddington's making the point that science, you mentioned meter readings. He said science has now really just been reduced to meter readings by relativity. And so the idea that then explains everything is ridiculous. He says in one of his books, the soul and God laugh at the matter, was what he said. The idea that we don't have a soul. I mean, Eddington, I didn't mention this, but he ended up very much in idealism as a philosopher. Yes, there's some Kantian elements to him. He was very influenced by George Berkeley, and some more of the British tradition. But he ended up coming down quite hard on materialism. In one of his books, he had a habit of, in his science books, the last chapter would be his philosophical reflections, and he writes a chapter called Reality at the end of one of his, I can't remember which book it was the last chapter of, but he talks about what reality is, and he says fundamentally the nature of ultimate reality is mind stuff. Sorry, he does talk about this in The Nature of the Physical World. Ultimate reality, the world around us, is mind first and matter second. And that's, obviously you can see the Quaker elements in that, but that's where his spirituality sort of emerges from in terms of where it intersects with science.
Is that where he lost respect of the general scientific community?
Oh, it outraged Russell. Russell then made it a personal quest to try and put out this science and religion fire before it gets too big and spreads. Russell sort of seemed to take it personally. But I'm aware this is kind of becoming our own conversation. I want to make sure other people
it's universal interest, I think, in some ways. But fine.
I see there's a question here in the chat that says there's a story of Eddington finding Lemaitre's thoughts on the beginning as repugnant. That's true. At first, Eddington was quite shocked by Lemaitre's findings. He came through because the maths worked, and there was no getting around that. And he shared the same interest. Eddington was just behind Lemaitre. He hadn't applied it to cosmology yet. But at the beginning, he found it very shocking. But the maths won out, and he ended up advocating for Lemaitre. Yeah, that's true.
As a question before, what would probably be the utility of a theory of everything? So we could discuss that in general, but also did Eddington have any thoughts about that? Was he looking at a theory of everything just kind of for interest? Or did he have application in mind? It
was quite a popular mission for Einstein's generation to try and unite relativity and quantum physics. I mean, you will all know about fine-tuning, I'm sure. Eddington was one of the early people to really be fascinated by the constants. Now, at the time, the number of constants known was not even half the number of constants we know now. But Eddington was quite switched on to that. He writes about them quite a bit in fundamental theory. But it was that generation, quite a number of them did try. Einstein tried, Hilbert tried. It's the generations after Eddington that sort of lost interest and started instead joining the race to find new subatomic particles and things like that. But it was popular. It was a popular ambition for that generation. Einstein doesn't get quite the flack that Eddington does for trying and failing, which seems somewhat unfair. but yeah, that it was an ambition of theirs. James Jeans writes a little book called The Astronomical Horizon, which is published a year or two after Eddington's death, and he basically translates Eddington's theory of everything in layman's terms very helpfully. But he points out that Eddington was quite unfortunate in that when he published, when fundamental theory was published, within a year, a couple of new constants were discovered and a couple of new subatomic particles were discovered, and his theory just broke down. And you wonder if Eddington had had that knowledge, would he have changed things a little bit? We'll never know.
Yeah. So just sticking on that kind of attempt to make a theory of everything, you were saying about you wanted to bring in mind and spirit into it. What was the thinking at the time around mind and spirit, that he thought that it wasn't such a big leap to do that he could bring them together?
Well, yeah, he thought that because relativity and quantum physics had ended materialism in his mind, that a theory of everything needed to be epistemological. You needed to start with your epistemology. And that's just a completely unique approach to what anyone else had done. Now, the maths, I don't understand it. It just reads like hieroglyphics to me, honestly. My science is genetics and molecular biology. I'm just doing this PhD because I'm really interested in Eddington. But it's a fascinating idea, and I don't know that anyone else has ever done it.
Another thought that occurred to me was you were talking about the Scopes trial in 1925 and how the focus on science and religion discussions was different in America. Did anything that Eddington wrote about it make any traction over there in other
yes authors? Yeah. Eddington was single his whole life. He wanted the academic life. There's a lot of speculation, therefore, that Eddington was gay. No one knows that. No one can prove it one way or the other. He was. Some of the people in Cambridge are sure that he was, but given everything that happened with Alan Turing later on, he tried to keep a small social climate. But what Eddington really wanted to do was live the scientific academic life. So he went to America a lot. He went to Australia. He went to Europe a great deal between the wars. He really did become a very strong ambassador for science and religion in the US. And like I said, he's credited with saving the faith of a lot of scientists who are feeling very squeezed over there.
Yeah. That's incredible legacy.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you're aware of that might be surprising from this period that maybe more people don't know about, that's maybe been uncovered in the last couple of decades?
Yeah, I think this is really damning to the new atheists, and I'm shocked that it didn't get out there more. I know Nick Spencer and others have done a really good job recently bringing more of the history of science and religion. Peter Bowler has, Peter Harrison has. But no one could look at that interwar period in physics and come to the conclusion that, we used to live in this era of religion, and then along came Einstein and all those guys, and bang, science woke up the world. You look at the history of that era, there's no way at first glance you could come to that conclusion. Einstein's God was very much Spinoza's God, but he was not the atheist. And Einstein had some really interesting stuff to say about Jesus. But then you have Schrödinger really became a kindred spirit with Eddington, I must note. Schrödinger really liked where Eddington was coming from. And Eddington had a great influence on a young Schrödinger. And although they didn't meet, there is some writing that he had a good influence on Heisenberg as well. But Schrödinger is no materialist sort of new atheist type. Heisenberg certainly isn't. Heisenberg's more open about his faith later on. And then you have Sir James Jeans and Edward Arthur Milne, who I am really digging into now. By the way, I sent a paper into Science and Christian Belief on Eddington, and myself and John Reynolds, who did his theology doctorate on Eddington and Jeans, we're doing a paper together at the moment on Sir James Jeans. Sir James Jeans, just like Eddington, hardly anyone knows who he is, but he's a colossal figure at the time. He was at the first Solvay conference with Einstein and all those guys, and he became, again, he moved very much into idealist philosophy and spirituality. And then you've got Edward Arthur Milne, who died quite young, sadly, but was a great writer on cosmology, and wrote Modern Cosmology and the Christian Idea of God, which is a phenomenal book. And these guys are just not really known, but they're giants at the time. And everywhere you look in that interwar physics generation, you find people who are either Christian, very open about their science and religion, or certainly not atheist. They take a spiritual or an idealist approach to what that was. It's just horrifically damning for the new atheist ideas of science and religion.
I think I'll get from you a list of kind of these writers and their books to send around to everyone who's registered here, because I think that would be a really useful resource for people. But would you recommend one or two books, either that look at this period of history or from that period of history? What would you do, your top two books?
If it's Eddington in particular, Matthew Stanley, who's professor at New York University, wrote a book called Practical Mystic, which is the subtitle is Science, Religion, and A.S. Eddington. And that's sort of a biography that also brings out all the Quaker approach to spirituality and science and religion. I think everyone should own Science and the Unseen World by Arthur Eddington. You can get it for like £2 or £3 on Amazon or on Kindle. It's just a little gem contribution to the science religion discussion. Nick Spencer wrote Magisteria a couple of years ago, last year, I think. If you want a good book about the popular history of science and religion, it doesn't mention Eddington much, but he does crop up. And Peter Bowler wrote a book called Science and Religion in the 20th Century, which gives it a better go. But other than that, there's not a great deal out there on Eddington. And it's just bizarre when you look at who he is and what he's done.
Well, we'll await your book on Eddington. So just the final question as we close. What is the kind of key thing that's come out of your study of Eddington in that period that's affected how you approach your own faith as well?
I am a lot more, when it comes to science and religion, for me personally, the truth lies in wonder, not in evidence. I'm not very evidentialist when it comes to this. I don't think there's any science in the Bible. I'm no fan of intelligent design, if you've read anything I've ever written. I sympathize a lot more with Eddington's basically grand spiritual theory of everything approach. Science is one aspect of the overall picture of Christianity being the grand theory of everything, and everything fits within it. So rather than, Big Bang equals God or fine-tuning equals God, I'm a lot more aligned with a sort of overarching Christianity is, in him all things hold together and in him all things consist. I probably completely butchered that verse in terms of exposition.
Yeah.
But Eddington's influenced me in terms of a much bigger picture rather than more linear picture than I used to have.
Yeah. All right. Again, we said about his legacy with those other scientists. So it's good his legacy is continuing even today. Yeah. So we're coming up to 8:30. So I just want to say thank you to our speaker for his talk and for the discussion afterwards. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure as your studies in Eddington continue, we might bring you back again for an update as well. And we'll definitely be keeping an eye out in the journal and elsewhere for you as well. So, yes, thank you to everyone who asked questions and made contributions to the discussion. And thank you all for coming as well. It's always an encouragement to have a good crowd of people to these things as well. And I've been seeing many comments in the chat window about how much we've all been appreciating Sam as well. So I'll send around some resources that I'll squeeze out of Sam as well, so you can do some following up as well. In the meantime, keep an eye on our online presence for CIS. So until next time, take care and God bless.